Hey good people, it's the Big Heavy, and yes, this is a camera video. And I know there's too many of these out on YouTube, but honestly, it's not my fault. You probably didn't realize, but deep down in the YouTube creator terms and conditions, it's actually mandatory that I have to do a camera video at some point. Also, at some point in the future, you'll see one of those ridiculous studio tours. I'll have to wear a backwards hat and I'll have to say some sort of "what's up, guys" kind of creative hipstery thing. But I will bring you a little overly dramatic teaser for this video where I'm going to tell you the dark secret that camera companies don't want you to know. Oh. But let's start with that teaser because I think that's something worth knowing and understanding if you're thinking about going into YouTube, if you're searching for a new camera just to take pictures of your dog or your kids or whatever, or just getting a little bit wrapped around the axle of gear obsession. And that dark secret that I don't really know if the camera companies care all that much if you know this or not, but it's use what you got. The best possible camera for YouTube or pictures of your kids or your dog or your milk cow or whatever you're taking pictures of is the one you already own. You know, that could be your phone, that could be, you know, some fancy digital SLR or camera like this that's been sitting in a drawer collecting dust. You don't need the latest and greatest. You don't need some super optimized thing. And if you don't believe me, I'd ask you this question. You know, if you're looking at two different videos, would you rather watch and stay engaged with one where the person has a great topic, it's really well structured, they're an interesting and engaging speaker, they share something with you in a logical and compelling fashion and ultimately give you some information you can act on, but you know, it's filmed on an iPhone 3, you know, it's not in 4K, maybe it looks a little janky, maybe the lighting's not perfect, but it has all those other things going for it. So would you watch that, or would you watch some video that's filmed on, you know, $60,000 of Hollywood grade equipment, the lighting's perfect, it's cinematic, which by the way, I'm contractually obligated by YouTube to use the word cinematic at least 4 times during this video, and has all the technical proficiency in the world, but the person isn't a very compelling speaker, they can't assemble a thought in a coherent manner, they're not giving you information that you can use, and you know, ultimately the content is garbage, even though it's on this technically perfect setup. At least for me, I'd rather watch that first video. I'm gonna get more out of it, and you know, maybe the audio is a little scratchy, maybe the video is a little janky, but the content at the end of the day is what drives the success of a video by and large. I think the technical proficiency is sort of icing on the cake, but if you've got a garbage cake, even the nicest, most delicious, sweetest buttercream is not gonna make a cake made out of turds taste much better than a bunch of turds. And what's further really interesting about that advice to use the camera you already have is it's actually a piece of good advice that I took myself. Generally, I'm quite adept at dispersing good advice, but don't always follow it. In this case, I actually did. And what kind of got me into YouTube was I have a writing side hustle. I was doing a lot of product reviews and for whatever reason kind of fell into this niche of doing power bank product reviews. I had Jackery send me their latest power bank, you know, wrote up this lovely article, was outside taking pictures for that article and thought, you know, maybe I should try this YouTube thing. I posted a random video of me tiling a floor, mostly to show my parents and friends that I could actually work with my hands and produce something reasonable, albeit in 900x the amount of time it would take a professional. And I was kind of surprised, and I logged into YouTube and saw this thing had a whole bunch of views. You know, I had a random collection of a couple hundred subscribers. And so I said, hey, let's see what this Jackery review video does, and let's see if I can make a go of this. And I started going down the rabbit hole of what kind of equipment do I need, what kind of cameras, blah, blah, blah. And you know, got the advice somewhere along the way to just use what I already had. And in that case, I had this Fujifilm X-T3 sitting in a drawer that I wasn't, you know, frankly doing all that much with. I've been into photography since I was a grade school age kid. You know, I used to mess around in darkrooms, that was back in the film days, and always found it fascinating. You know, I'd save lawn mowing money to get a new lens or to get a camera body or whatnot, and took that hobby through college. I took some college classes on photography and again was able to spend some more time in a nice professional grade darkroom, and then kind of fell out of, you know, what I would call doing photography, where it was sort of an act in and of itself, but got interested in digital photography back in the early days before smartphones were really a thing. I had one of the original Canon ELPH cameras, which was this really cool compact camera. I think at some point I had some weird camera that recorded pictures to CDs back before memory cards were common. And ultimately ended up with a big digital SLR, and I would travel around and do, you know, very serious landscape photography with tripods and all this stuff. And then I had kids. And if you have kids, you know that they kind of force you to focus since they're a tiny little human being that needs everything done for them. And a lot of your hobbies and some of the things you do for entertainment fall by the wayside. For me, photography was one of those things that kind of fell by the wayside, particularly when they were young. And I put away the big SLR, I put away the tripods and all my cool, Ansel Adams aspirations, and started taking pictures of the little guy and ultimately the additional kids, and got focused on how do I get a smaller camera so I can take pictures of the kids. That led me down this rabbit hole that ultimately had me with an Olympus Micro Four Thirds system. And as my kids were getting more involved in sports and kind of doing things that didn't quite work on a smartphone, I wanted to get something that was a little bit more compact, a little higher quality, and at the time it looked like Olympus might go out of business. And Fujifilm I found somewhere along the way in my reviews. What I liked about this camera was it was a little higher quality than Micro Four Thirds. It has a little bit bigger sensor. It does video, which I wasn't super concerned about at the time, but thought, hey, it'd be worth having a video tool in my toolbox. And as a bit of a retro grouch, I kind of like that it has all these dials and has a little bit of a old-fashioned camera look to it versus a bit of a digital machine kind of look to it. I will offer the disclaimer that while I am a bit of a retro grouch, I won't go so far as to tell you how vinyl is superior and how I spent $90,000 on record players and amplifiers that basically sound half as good as digital music, but that's a story for another time. So this was a completely unintentional, not thinking about YouTube whatsoever when I purchased this camera kind of purchase. It was more, how do I take pictures of my kids' Little League games? How do I capture some action? And at the time I was a pretty horrible smartphone photographer. I think that's a skill that takes a little bit of time to develop. My wife would take brilliant pictures with a smartphone. All of my stuff would look like junk. So I kind of stuck to real cameras for a while. And once I got a little better at the smartphone, this guy kind of ended up on a shelf and wasn't getting much use. So returned back to that Jackery video, went to my shelf, blew the dust off this guy, charged his batteries up, watched a video or two on how to set this thing up to record video, made sure I had the right memory cards in there and whatnot, and shot that first Jackery review, which incidentally did surprisingly well, and it made me think, hey, maybe there's something to this YouTube thing. Seems like it might be an amusing side hustle. So all the videos you've seen on my channel up until this point were shot with this Fuji X-T3. Some of my camping videos where I actually did on an iPhone just because I didn't bring a camera with me out into the woods. So, one more point in the favor of shoot with what you've got, and an iPhone is a perfectly serviceable video camera in a lot of cases. But I had a few minor beefs with the X-T3 that caused me to start looking around. So first of all, this camera has a rather lovely articulating screen that comes out, and there's a nice little metal contraption, and it's very satisfying and kind of clicks into place. But it doesn't rotate around. So there's no way to actually see yourself when you're looking at the camera. And I think this came out in like 2018-ish. So that was sort of before doing YouTube was a thing. And before, I guess, there was a huge demand for cameras where you could sit there and stare at the thing and also have a little screen popped out that you could look at while you were talking to it. There's also some challenges around battery life. I could probably get about 1 or 1.25 videos done off one single battery, which doesn't sound too bad, but the challenge is you're kind of trying to record yourself, you're trying to talk into the lens and not constantly be glancing at the monitor because you can see someone's eyes darting around if I'm sneaking a little peek into the monitor over there. And it also had a 30-minute recording limit when shooting in 4K. So when I was talking to the camera, I'd either frequently be peeping over to the side to see if the battery light was flashing or seeing if I had exceeded that 30-minute limit. And when the 30-minute limit was exceeded, the camera wouldn't really do anything to let you know. It flashes storing for a few minutes and a little tiny red dot that was up in the corner of the monitor would go away. So there were quite a few times where I'd be blabbing away, I'd be really getting into one of the complex power bank reviews or something like that. And then I'd take a good hard look at the camera and realize that I hadn't been recording for, who knows how long. I'd have to go back, load up the video, figure out where I left off, try and, regather my thoughts and re-record the piece where I got cut off and go from there, which wasn't particularly effective. I also had some complaints about the autofocus, and if you start to watch camera reviews of any kind where Sony is one of the contenders that they're talking about, or even if Sony's not even being reviewed, just somebody somewhere will probably mention Sony's autofocus. This is my first video that I'm shooting for the channel with this camera, so I can't say it's wildly superior yet. I've done some testing and playing around and goofing around with some photo and video stuff just to kind of get a feel for it. And it's definitely superior to what Fujifilm has in the X-T3. That doesn't matter too much when I'm shooting a video like this, where I'm sitting in the chair and essentially talking to you guys. I'm not moving around all that much. But for some of the product stuff, I think it's gonna make a big difference. You know, when you're doing a panning shot on a product, being able to lock the focus to it is great. If I'm doing something outside where I'm walking around a little bit more and, you know, obviously don't have a camera person, so it's just me staring into a machine. The machine having the ability to actually track me and lock onto me and keep me in focus will be, I think, a nice addition. The other minor factor that tilted me in the direction of the Sony is it's a full frame camera. So that basically means the sensor which records the image data is a little bit larger than what's in the Fujifilm. I don't think that's life-changing. You know, I think a lot of people get wrapped around the axle on full frame versus what's called a cropped sensor. I'm of the opinion that all things being equal, more pixels is better. You know, if you go to a movie, an IMAX movie is generally going to be sharper than a standard movie, and that's because it's shot on a physically bigger piece of film. But that wasn't something that was, you know, absolutely compelling me to upgrade. I think more of those creature comforts and usability things around video are what had me looking in the market, particularly those limits to recording and, you know, having a few videos where I either lost my train of thought or the thing got derailed a little bit and I had to reshoot a significant piece because the battery died or I hit that 30-minute limit. I actually started my shopping kind of thinking I'd stay within the Fujifilm realm. And Fujifilm just came out with a bunch of new cameras. They have the X-T5, which is the grandson of the X-T3 right here. And I was kind of focusing on the XHS2. And I don't know who comes up with these brand names. I think Fuji's trying to outpace Sony for the most confusing model numbering scheme in the history of humankind, but maybe that's a story for another time. But what I liked about the XHS2 is that it let me keep my one Fujifilm lens. You know, Fujifilm had treated me well. I liked the styling, I liked the build quality, I liked how these things were put together. So there was a lot to be said for staying in the family. But as I started looking at some of the reviews, a few things stuck out. You know, first off, it was that constant comparison to Sony's autofocus, and there's lots of side-by-side tests out there. And the conclusion of most of those side-by-side tests seemed to be that the XH2S was definitely significantly better than something like the X-T3, but it wasn't quite up to Sony standards. And I kind of got to thinking, you know, hey, I should at least look at the Sony. You know, everyone's saying this thing's the standard, and you know, it's got the best autofocus in the industry, so it's worth a check. And the more I researched, I kept coming back to that Sony as a standard kind of feeling. Most of the big YouTube channels and a lot of people in the film and video industry are using Sony equipment. There's tons of lenses out there, whereas Fujifilm might have 1 or 2 lenses in a given focal length. Sony will have, you know, 3 to 6 or 7 between Sony and some of the other manufacturers that are able to use their mount and produce lenses. The other pro to being kind of in that industry standard sort of space is that there's tons of videos, there's tons of how-tos, there's lots and lots of information about the Sony cameras out there. You know, at least a couple or 3x what you'd find on Fujifilm. So any questions I had on initial setup or things like that, I'd type, you know, Sony A7 IV into YouTube and whatever my specific question was, and I'd find a half dozen videos of people that had a similar problem or had a similar question, and the corresponding half a dozen solutions on how to fix that problem. I was a little sad that I was giving up the retro grouch styling with the Sony camera, but the Fuji XH2S had also abandoned the retro grouch styling. So in either case, I was kind of going towards something that looked more like a, you know, computing / video camera type device versus, you know, a nice old school film style camera. The other thing with Sony's, the pro to their model naming being just absolutely bonkers. You know, there's 15 different cameras that start with A7, and there's S's and R's and 4s and 3s and 2s and all this other crazy shit that took me 45 minutes to figure out just what they were talking about. They have so many bodies that if you want to move within the system, you know, if you want to go more towards a film type camera, there's a series of cameras that use the same lenses. If you want to go more towards a photography camera, there's a series of cameras that again use those same lenses. There's kind of a line of sports cameras, there's a line of hybrid cameras, which is what I ultimately went with the A7 IV. So if I were to add a camera, you know, if this channel got big enough that I wanted to do things with multiple cameras, or if I decided I wanted to go in a little bit of a different direction, it's pretty easy to change camera bodies. There's an old clip in photography circles that you date the body and you marry the lens. Sony makes that pretty easy since there are so many bodies, there are so many lenses. It's easy to find a combination that works for you. And if you decide you want to upgrade or downgrade or kind of left or right grade, there's at least 3 or 4 options without having to go and sell all your lenses and invest in new lenses. So after all that hype about Sony, there are a few initial nitpicks that I have so far. And again, this is first video with this camera. This is after using it for nothing more than some test shots and kind of getting familiar with it. But there's already a few things that have struck me. The first is Fujifilm was, I guess you'd say, notorious in a good way for doing firmware updates. This camera at this point is like 4 years old, and Fujifilm is still putting out new software for this camera. And it's not just, hey, we fixed a bug or we changed some menu. There's meaningful new features in the software updates. It seems like Fujifilm is always trying to get the absolute best out of their hardware by giving you updates to software, which is really cool. It's a little bit of that Tesla idea where you buy the vehicle, you get new software that makes it more valuable over its lifetime. And I think that's definitely been the case. I also have an X100V, which is Fujifilm's kind of retro grouch street photography fixed lens camera, which really like, super cool camera. Everyone seems to love them for whatever reason several years after it was released. But that guy's still getting new software all the time that adds new features and fixes stuff. Sony, interestingly enough, just released a version 2.0 of their software for the A7 IV, and as best I can tell, all it does is let you use some new mobile app that frankly looks kind of janky and isn't something that I really see myself using all that much. The conspiratorial view of that is based on the fact that they have so many different camera bodies. They want to keep some features very narrowly confined within each series. So, I have the camera that's supposed to be the hybrid, so it's kind of good at photography, kind of good at video, but not a master of either. It probably has the hardware to do a lot more than what the software allows it to do. So things like shooting high speed with a full frame sensor, the rumor is that that's crippled in software. It's not necessarily a problem with the hardware, and that's just Sony kind of trying to force you to either buy multiple bodies or to stick within your lane in terms of the series of camera you're buying versus trying to give you a camera that does the maximum that it possibly can with the hardware. And there's fairly simple things that the Sony is missing, things like shutter angle, which makes it a little easier to keep track of your shutter speed based on different frame rates, some other little niceties that they could very easily update in software that don't seem like they would require any additional hardware updates, but they don't want to give you those because if you want something like shutter angle, in Sony's mind, you should go and buy yourself one of their specialized film cameras. The other thing I'm not 100% sure if I'm gonna love is full frame, get more pixels, generally more awesome, all the things I said. The negative to full frame is it makes for bigger lenses in this case. The body is surprisingly similar in size to my X-T3, but the lens is clearly a little bigger, although this is a little bit of a nicer lens. This is a Tamron f2.8, so that's gonna let in a little more light, gonna let you, blur the background a little bit more and do things like that. But my jury's still out on whether the benefits of full frame are going to be worth the additional weight, and I'll probably find that out in pretty dramatic fashion when we go to Europe this summer as part of the Workcation video series, which I'll link up above. But part of what will be included in that series is our experience executing a workcation and living and working from France. And I plan on bringing kind of a minimalist / as much as I can get away with sort of setup that will include this Sony camera, and will have me shooting from the streets of Paris and from our various apartments that we're going to be staying in along the way. So it'll be interesting to see if the full frame is worth the extra weight and kind of bulk that we'll have to transport all the way to another country. So that's kind of the why that I ultimately switched from Fujifilm to Sony. And again, it was more, hey, I want something new and cool to play with. Started out with, I'll stick within the Fujifilm family. And then after watching a few reviews, Sony kind of came onto my radar. I also looked at Canon. I looked a little bit at Panasonic, has a new camera out that everyone's hyped up. But the fact that Sony ultimately has so many lenses, it's kind of this industry standard, gives me some ability to change the body without having to buy new lenses if my interests or kind of my channel growth dictates that. So it seems like a good path forward. Again, I could be perfectly fine continuing to shoot on the X-T3. I'd probably be just as fine and hopefully just as entertaining and amusing if I was shooting all this on my iPhone. And that kind of leaves us with, at least in this day and age, I think any digital camera / smartphone / video camera that was built in the last 10 years or so is going to be effective enough to get you on YouTube. If you find you're spending dozens or hundreds of hours researching equipment and trying to figure out the absolute best combinations of specs and prices and which lenses do I need and which bag and try and all that stuff, just call a timeout on yourself. Sit down and apply some of that energy to writing up a list of videos that you think would be interesting and that you think you're uniquely qualified to put out there. Spend that time writing a script for one or two of them, or just sit down and lean your phone up against a can of soup or whatever and film your first YouTube video. And maybe it's absolute garbage. Maybe you don't even post it. Maybe you just look at it and say, hey, that was utterly horrible, but here's what I learned. Here's the things I'll tweak and change, and this is something I want to pursue. Same thing if you're watching this for photography. Instead of looking at that perfect camera that's going to capture your daughter's flying leap through the air in her dance class and crisp full frame resolution, go out and take your iPhone and get some pictures of her and her girlfriends or fellow dancers laughing and giggling and doing all the stuff tiny dancers like to do. I think you'll find that a lot more valuable having 100 of those shots that you can go back and look at and have this positive memory and share with her as she grows up, instead of having 0 shots but having obsessed over the perfect camera and ultimately got the right camera and the right lens and the right this and the right that, but missing the recital because you got called out of town or something happened and have 0 pictures. So as always, wish you the best in whatever creative endeavors that you're engaging in that have you interested in cameras and watching yet another YouTube camera video. I wish you the best in your search, and hopefully your search is not very long because you already have the perfect camera, at least for getting started, sitting in your pocket, or maybe it's sitting up on a shelf somewhere, and you focus your energy that you would have otherwise spent obsessing over the technology and going out and pursuing the creativity, not the gear aspect of it. Now with that, I'm gonna go and gear up for some editing, see how the video looks coming off of this camera for my very first official Sony powered YouTube video. Wish you well in all your creative endeavors, and this is the Big Heavy saying peace. Ever wonder why every talking head on YouTube asks you to hit the like and subscribe button at the end of their video? You were right, because we're living in a computer simulation. And our benevolent robotic overlords get just a little bit of energy every time you hit that like. So do me, the rest of civilization, and our benevolent robotic overlords a favor. Mash that subscribe, be kind to each other, keep living your simulated dreams.